Okay, I think we're live.
Great.
So welcome everyone to this session of AAC in the Cloud. Our speaker for this session is Tannlynn Neufeld from Seattle, Washington, a speech language pathologist, and she also teaches AAC at the University of Washington. Her presentation is on using typical language development to guide AAC practices. So welcome, Tana. We're so glad to have you, and we will look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Nancy. I'm really happy to be here. I've attended the last few, I think, but I've never presented at AAC in the Cloud. So I'm an AAC in the Cloud newbie. Be kind and gentle to me. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides and we'll get going. So as Nancy so kindly mentioned, I am Tannlynn Neufeld, and I'm going to talk to you today about something that's probably very familiar to most of you in the audience, and that is typical communication development. And we'll go into a little bit about why I chose this topic, as maybe at first glance it doesn't seem super AAC related. Just to start out, I think my handouts are posted on my little YouTube page for AAC in the Cloud. But just in case you didn't get a chance to click there, there's a link here that you can follow for my handouts as well. So a little bit about me. I am a speech language pathologist by training. I've been practicing for a little over 15 years, I think. On this slide in your handouts, you'll see I've got my hand in quite a few pots at the moment. I'm a little bit of a AAC geek, and I like to do a lot of things AAC, as I'm sure all of you can relate to. So other than being a speech language pathologist and having my own consulting practice here in Seattle, I'm also a full-time clinical instructor and teaching professor at the University of Washington. I am the director and founder of Accessible, which you're going to see a lot of today because I am here representing Accessible, which is really a fun passion project that I started and am working with a great team of people to build, really around bringing even more wonderful resources like AAC in the Cloud, these free and low-cost ways for the AAC community to increase their learning and really help to kind of cut this mystification that kind of goes with this field. So you can find a lot of information on Accessible's website. There's trainings, there's resources, there's community there. I love collaborating with other professionals and with families, so you can reach me here on my links through social media. You'll also notice today that I am using a screen magnifier. I am a visually impaired person, and so as I'm sharing my slides, you're going to see my cursor kind of going wonky all over the place. Just know that is because I am using a screen magnifier to kind of help me navigate, and I'll be doing some weird Zoom screen magnification magic as I present today, trying to prevent you from seeing a magnified screen when you're looking at some of the videos I have to share. So I'm hoping we have time for questions today. Please go ahead and post comments and questions in the Slack channel. Nancy is going to be my right-hand lady here to monitor that for me because it is quite challenging for me to see the Slack channel while I'm presenting. Go ahead and curate your comments and questions there. I hope we have some time at the end to address them. But if we don't, you do have a link at the end of your slides for a forum on my website, or I'll go back in the Slack channel and try to address as many of them as I can there. And you can, of course, reach out to me on any of these channels as well if you have questions, and I'd be happy to chat through them with you. All right, last disclosure, I am a creator on Boom Learning and Teachers Pay Teachers. I'm not going to be talking about any of those products today, but I am going to be highlighting a couple of the resources that are on Accessible that I have created. Some of them are free, some of them are very low cost, and I'm also going to be talking about a couple trainings that are offered there. So just a full disclosure on that, and we will move on. So I just want to start by talking about typical language development not being a new thing, right? This is not my idea. I didn't coin this idea, obviously. I heard some voices. Is everything going okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to really give a shout out to our pioneers, and I've cited a couple here on the screen. Of course, Gillivan Tatenhove, Dr. Binger, and Dr. Kent Walsh, all of these wonderful pioneers in our field who have really shed some light on these topics already. This idea of using our typical language development continuum, our typical communication continuum, to help us produce sound AAC practices, both in assessment and in intervention. So as we walk through some frameworks today, which I've kind of put together from all of these wonderful pioneering resources and in my own clinical experience, we're really building on these wonderful works. And I've cited them throughout and provided some resources at the end for anybody who'd like to go to the source of a lot of this great research and practice information. I also want to emphasize that although a lot of what I'm sharing in my frameworks that I'm going to talk about today is based on my clinical experiences in AAC assessment and intervention, that all of these are based on evidence-based practices. So all of those pioneering research studies that have come before this point, not only in AAC, but in language development and language learning in general, are really coming to the core of what I hope to share with everybody today. And that being said, a lot of it may seem like kind of grad school repeat if you're a speech language pathologist, just dusting off of a lot of that language development foundation that you built as a graduate student and an early professional. And I think that one of my catalysts for really taking on this typical development approach in my trainings that I do for professional education and also in the way I teach my graduate students in my current course has been from my prior experiences in the field where I really lost track of AAC being a part of typical communication development. It was kind of taught to me or perceived by me in my early learning as this separate thing, right? It's the technology and the tools. And it wasn't until a couple years into my practice and really being mentored by some amazing people and taking some wonderful trainings that it really became obvious to me that I wasn't doing my best work when I wasn't keeping typical development really in my mind. And I was perhaps making some leaps in my technology and AAC approaches because I was almost overlooking all of this gray area of development that happens for children from birth on through the communication journey. As you go through the presentation in your slides, you're going to see a lot of these little toolboxes. Anywhere you see this little green circle is a clickable resource. There's also some clickable links throughout your slides and some clickable documents. So I'll try to draw your attention to where you can go for more information on these topics. We do only have an hour. It's not enough to dive into this whole continuum of topics, but hopefully between what we share today and the resources that you get for further learning, you'll feel like you have some starting points. So let's start in with this COMPASS framework. So I have provided some trainings, or I've actually done an assessment one, and there's an intervention one coming up in later this summer. And it's, again, this idea of taking all of these principles of assessment based on communication development and approaching them with a framework that tries to help those of you who might not be AAC experts and maybe don't even aspire to be such, really approach those students and those clients that are coming to you every day for support with a little bit more of a clear plan, a little bit less of confusing, overwhelming, situation for you. So this is probably a framework that you've already used in your other assessment practices. You've probably heard about it. But again, this COMPASS is just an idea of we've got this very complicated, nuanced situation of supporting a communicator with complex needs. How do we really break this task down? Not necessarily to become that AAC evaluation expert, but really to add to your toolbox that you left graduate school with and that you honed through your early practice to give you a starting point and to give you direction for knowing when to team and when to take, this professional ed course. So in this COMPASS, you'll see it starts at the very top with this communication assessment, and we're going to spend pretty much most of our time today talking about that piece of assessment. We know that our AAC situations differ in that we do need to consider access needs, which is not something we would do in a typical speech and language environment as a SLP professional. So we're going to spend a lot of time about communication, not talk much about access, but remember that it's an important difference. And then, of course, our AAC assessment process continues with some feature matching, which is key. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to match or how to think about matching those skills and needs of your individual students to the features that you might be looking for in technology. We then, of course, do a trial in our assessment process. We might make some decisions on equipment and strategies. And then this is where these 3 prongs here are where our intervention and our assessment really start kind of intermingling, right? Because as we trial, we're offering support and we're offering dynamic assessment and intervention strategies that help that child demonstrate some potential to use that system that we might be aiding their family and their team in obtaining for them. So looking a little bit closer at the assessment part of this compass, again, the point here of an AAC assessment, from my perspective, is really to match those tools to the skills and needs of the individual child. So I would say in my practice, 90% of my AAC assessment focuses on communication skills and needs. And then, of course, what do I need from my motor and my vision support team to help me with the access component for those students that may have those needs in place? There's an infographic here that kind of breaks down those broad categories of assessment that I've put in my Compass framework, and you can click on the link here and get a free infographic PDF version of this if you'd like. But we're going to focus today talking a lot about this communication piece and very little about these other elements of the assessment process, just for the sake of time. Before we dive into thinking about our complex communicators, I think I find it most useful to meet you if you're a novice AAC person, perhaps a parent even in the audience, at the point of what happens in typical communication development. What does that early communication journey look like for kids, for babies and onward? So let's walk through a couple ways to think about it. If we're talking about the Bates model, which is a model I use a lot in my teaching with graduate students, and one that I really focus on a lot in my practice with those emerging communicators, which we're going to discuss in a minute, we're going to think about a communication journey in terms of perlocutionary, which is pre-intentional, and then it moves through elocutionary and locutionary. These words should ring a bell if you've been in child development realms or language development coursework in the last 10 years. But these words are kind of confusing and muddy, and so I like to think about it in this way. And this is kind of building on the work of Tracy Kovic in her AAC profile assessment tool. And that is, perlocutionary is our kids who are in the communication awareness phase. And remember, we're talking about all kids here. We're talking about the early communication journey for babies and forward, not necessarily just complex communicators. So that perlocutionary is communication awareness. I'm going to dive into this a little bit more in the coming slides. And then elocutionary is that communication exploration, right? And then we really come to that communication with shared meaning. And that is where our early communicators start diving into language. So all of these phases occur before language. Once they get into this communication with shared meaning phase, we're now into language or symbolic communication. So when we think about these pieces, in looking at what happens over the course of communication development in this early stage, really what the infant is doing is developing control, right? Control over his or her body, eyes, movements, ideas, eventually cognition control, and then also intention. This is the hugest part of this phase, the development of intentionality. The infant's also working on developing convention. So the infant's moving from being aware of communication, not having a lot of control over her body, to gaining a little bit more control and being intentional in her behavior, but not quite communicative yet. And then developing some communication intent through some less conventional means of doing so. And we're going to talk at length about those in a moment. And then moving into convention, and that's where those shared meaning gestures come in, usually at the same time of first words or shortly before first words, right? So the baby's working on convention and also working toward symbolic language in this phase. So thinking about this in terms of our complex communicators, I've worked really closely for the last several years, probably about 3 years, with a colleague, Dr. Patricia Dowden, who developed the Communicative Independence Continuum, the CCI. And so she would describe these communicators as emerging communication, right? So you've seen those terms in the literature, you probably use them a lot. And these are pre-symbolic communicators, or those without reliable symbol use. So we're going to talk about those in a minute, using some different language, but remembering this idea of pre-symbolic. All right, so this is where my interesting magnification and zoom stuff comes into play. First, let's take a minute and talk a little bit about this stage, and then we're going to watch a little video clip of this infant. So if we're thinking about that communication awareness stage, communication awareness starts before babies are born, right? It starts in utero with listening. And so we want to think about, what does communication awareness look like, and what are some of the things that are kind of going on in this developmental stage for these infants? So thinking about this stage, we want to remember that all of what this baby is doing is non-volitional. It's reflexive, right? And it's unintentional. The behaviors that we see at this stage are not under the baby's control, and they're more related to internal states like hunger, thirst, being tired, etc. Some of the types of behaviors we'll see here are going to be body movements, vocalizations. We might see a little bit of facial expressions happening. And really what's going on from a communication perspective is the caregiver is taking the full responsibility of watching the baby's behavioral cues and anticipating the baby's needs, right? This should be sounding familiar as to how some of the caregivers you might be working with are supporting their complex communicators who might be at this pre-intentional phase. So I'm going to go ahead and start this video, which is going to be a little bit of an example of some of these behaviors. And I'm calling them behaviors because, remember, they're not quite communicative yet, and they're not intentional. And we're going to change our language a little bit when that shift happens. So here we go. So let's talk a little bit about what we saw, right? So we heard a lot of vocalizations, a lot of grunting, a lot of body movements. They looked quite reflexive, quite out of the baby's control. We also saw some of that mouthing of the hand happen towards the end, right? And what do you think that means? Let's think for a minute. If the baby is mouthing his hand, if anybody in the audience has had an infant anytime soon or recently, that's probably a cue of hunger, right? Mom might read that as a cue of hunger. And then the baby eventually starts to grimace and make some facial expressions that definitely look like he is not happy, and then starts to cry, right? So as a caregiver, as I'm watching this baby, I'm going to be interpreting this fussy behavior, this facial expression of grimace, this nodding of the hand as a hunger cue. And I'm going to respond, and I'm probably going to talk about what I think that means with this baby. And already he's going to start getting that input around, oh, what's wrong? Something's wrong. You're hungry. Okay, let's feed you. And then we're going to move through and honor that communication, knowing that it's not yet intentional, right? So keep that in your mind, because it's a very important concept when we think about what we're looking for in assessment for complex communicators who might be at this stage, and in turn, what we would develop as intervention goals for a communicator at this stage. All right, let me go back and do my share without this on. Okay. Again, remember, you've got these circles throughout. This particular one's going to send you to some YouTube playlists where you can watch additional videos of these types of signals, and also tons of other video playlists for AAC related and communication development related resources. Whoops, my magnifier is showing up. Give me a second, guys. I'm going to stop it and start over. The woes of Zoom. They're not completely disability friendly yet, but they're getting there. All right, let's try it again. There we go. That's a little bit better. Nope, it's not. Okay. Bear with me. I'm going to fix it. All right, let's try it. Third time's a charm, right? You can do Linda Burkhart's chant to the technology gods. Please technology work, please technology work, please technology work. Yay, I think it worked. Awesome, okay. So going back, let's get back on track. We are here, this little cutie. Okay, so let's move on now and talk about the next stage. So at this point, this control starts to develop, right? So the baby is moving into getting more control over his movements, his behavior. So there's voluntary movement, volitional movement going on, but it still remains unintentional. However, the baby's starting to get a little bit of needs and desires, maybe develop some ideas, right? Ideas of what he wants, and not as reliant on those states, but still the caregiver needs to interpret those ideas and those needs. He's going to still use a lot of the same signals that we saw in that first stage, facial expressions, and a new emergence of eye gaze. Eye gaze is going to be really important for our complex communicators. If anybody's followed the work of Dr. Olswang and Dr. Feuerstein on triadic eye gaze, it really becomes useful in our intervention process for kids with complex bodies. And we'll revisit that in a minute when we talk about intervention. So the responsiveness from the caregiver in this stage and the previous is what's going to shape intentionality, right? So as the baby's developing control and producing intentional behaviors, intentional movement, the caregiver is going to continue to assign meaning to those movements and shape intentionality through responsiveness, right? Also, the baby is going to start to be more responsive, and that's what you're going to see here. With more control comes that volley that happens in this very early stage. So I'm going to go ahead and share another video, and we're going to watch this little guy with some voluntary behavior that remains unintentional at this stage. don't think that played, so I'm going to play it again.
That's so funny. That's so funny.
So let's talk a little bit about what we saw there. This baby was smiling in response to those raspberries. You also should have noticed some differences in his gaze. So as that stimulus of the raspberry happened and he was smiling, his gaze was up at the caregiver. And then once the caregiver took her turn, his gaze kind of reverted downward again, and then it was back up, and then it was back down. So he was starting to use gaze to kind of regulate that interaction. And at the end of the interaction, his gaze and his facial expressions changed, and he kind of disengaged from the game, right? And the caregiver then stopped the video. So these are super important signals to be looking for in our communication, emerging communicators in our assessment process so that we can build upon them, right? And we're going to talk about that coming up here soon. All right, I'm going to pause this again and let's go back. All right, good. So moving on to the third one, talk about our third stage. Now we've got intentionality being this huge milestone that's happening in this pre-symbolic phase, right? And intentional communication emerges, but it still remains a little bit unconventional and it's not symbolic yet at this stage. However, I'm going to start talking about these behaviors now as signals because they are intentional, which means that they are communicative behaviors at this stage, right? They're signals for that partner to respond to. They're going to include a lot of the same movements we've already been talking about, a lot of the same behaviors like body movements, vocalizations, facial expressions, and then of course now we also get some use of early gesture coming in. And this caregiver responsiveness is going to continue to be super important, not only to continuing to strengthen intentionality, but that responsiveness is going to include modeling more advanced signals and more conventional signals, right? So we're going to see modeling happen in caregiver responses, both in use of gesture, like pointing, showing, giving, and also in use of verbal language for these typically developing children. And later on, we'll talk about that visual language too, through our aided language modeling that becomes super important. So this is in that continuum we mentioned at the beginning, right? That communication awareness, communication exploration, and communication with shared meaning. This is where communication exploration really starts happening. I've got intentional control over my little body. I have a message that I want to say to you. Now I'm intentionally communicating through my gestural language. So let's take a look at this short clip of this little guy at this stage.
Lincoln. Hi. You're supposed to be sleeping. Why are you not sleeping? You silly goose. Say night-night to your woman up. Night-night, lion. Yeah. Night-night, lion.
So let's talk about what we see in this clip, right? You see clearly a baby who has more control over his body. You see that beautiful reciprocal smile and eye gaze that we saw in that prior stage, but you also see the baby playing with his voice, right? So he's communicating. We don't know what it is necessarily. He doesn't have the ability to use those conventional gestures in the position that he's in, but he's communicating with us using vocalizations and taking those early vocal turns along with turns using eye gaze and turns using facial expressions. Another really important thing to consider for our complex communicators in our assessment and intervention process, right? Okay, I think we're done with the videos for a while, or maybe for a minute. Let's move forward. Oh no, I lied. We have more videos. So now we're moving into that away from communication exploration, and we're getting into this amazing stage of before and during and after those first words development, right? Where we have now conventional communication signals happening, non-symbolic at first. They're going to emerge here. Things like pointing and shaking head yes and no, using giving and showing, as I mentioned before. And at this stage of developmentally 12 to 18 months, usually we might even see some first words coming in at the same time. So that shared meaning piece really comes from this idea that now this baby is using symbols, right? When we use symbols, we've got a shared meaning not only with those closest to us, but those in our larger community that share the same symbol set or language with us. So it's a huge milestone that we're really hoping to get our complex communicators to. It happens very early on in typical development, but you see all of this amazing growth that happens through communication, early communication skills development that really sets the best foundation for that symbol development. So let's take a little look here. And I think what I love about this video and what you would enjoy if you go and take a look at this YouTube playlist with some other videos of great gestural communication is it really illustrates how valuable it is to have a robust gesture inventory. This little guy is having a full conversation about this snack he's about to have using gesture, eye gaze, and facial expressions. And there are at least 2 other videos in the YouTube playlist that show the same rich communication. And anybody in the audience who's taken a DIR or floor time course, you probably know Stanley Greenspan's coining of the term circles of communication, right? And how we're hoping to build for complex communicators these amazingly robust and frequent circles of communication. And we can do that even while they're in this non-symbolic phase, right? And moving into these early symbol usage through gestures. So let's take a minute to watch this next short clip. It's a very short one.
Cream. Yes, right. Tell Daddy where to put it. Here. Yay!
So let's talk about that clip. I didn't resume my share in the first 10 seconds or so of it, but in the beginning, you heard the caregiver asking, "What do you want?" He gestured like spraying the whipped cream can, so came up with a gesture, a little conventional gesture or idiosyncratic sign of his own, and then told Daddy where to put it, and then of course shared that beautiful joy of getting the whipped cream in his bowl by working the room with his eye gaze and smiling and then digging in and eating it. So it was a rich, short little conversation, but all took place using gaze, using facial expressions, and using some gestures. And what we build from here is, as we've been talking through this whole early communication journey, is we build those more advanced language models, right? In our responsiveness as partners for a child, even at this stage, we're talking about the labels that match those non-symbolic signals. And if we're working with a complex communicator, hopefully we are also showing those complex language models using our aided language stimulation. All right. So let's talk about some complex communicators. This is Kyle, not his real name, not his real picture, and also a little bit of a tweak on his actual history, but based on a client that came to me with complex needs in search of some AAC. His family was in search of some AAC. So Kyle is a 2.5-year-old little boy with cerebral palsy and cortical visual impairment. He was not using mouth words or verbal communication at the time, but was really vocal, very vocal with his vocalizations. He was receiving OT, PT, SLP, and vision services with his really rock star early intervention team. He had a previous AAC evaluation, but his family was told that he was not appropriate for AAC technology or systems at that time. He didn't have any symbols in place, and his family really was communicating with him through anticipating those needs, really guessing based on his behaviors, mostly his vocalizations, right? So this is one picture of a complex communicator. Should be ringing some bells, right, of some of those skills and needs we just talked about in that early communication journey of that pre-intentional communicator, pre-symbolic communicator. We also have another example here of Sarah, also not her name, not her picture, but based on a client that came to me for an AAC assessment. This is a 5-year-old with autism spectrum. She is also not speaking according to her family. She receives only ABA services, no other services of record, and no previous evaluations for AAC. Her family said she was using PECS, but wasn't having a lot of success with those, picture exchange communication system. And they reported that she really just gets what she wants. She was a little one who would climb the kitchen counters to get the foods that she wanted, and really just try to get the things she wanted as her first resort. If she couldn't, she would cry, or she may act in a certain way, and the family would then try to interpret what she needed using those behavioral signals. So she should start also looking to you a lot like some of those early communicators we just met, as far as her communication profile. Now, this doesn't mean that she's functioning like an infant, right? Let's be clear. Our communicators that are at early stages of communication development are not at early stages of everything. They're not functioning like babies. I don't use age equivalents in my assessment reports at all because of this reason. But I think it's helpful to see their communication profile in this light because it helps us move them through. Right? It helps us move them through that continuum that's supportive of building that strong foundation upon which to introduce symbols. So let's talk a little bit about assessment highlights. And again, I have a full training on AAC assessment. I don't have time to go into all of the tools and tricks I use, but I wanted to hit some broad strokes for these types of early communicators. My go-to is a chart review. I can learn so much from a chart, right? We just talked about 2 clients, and I bet some of you in the audience are already thinking about what your assessment would look like based on just that short snippet of information. Because these are pre-intentional communicators really early in their journey, I want to focus on interview and observation with familiar partners, right? So very little I'm going to be able to get from a child who is in the emerging stages of communication as an unfamiliar partner. I want to see how they do with the people who know them best, right? And then I want to talk about what they're challenged with, what they're struggling with those less familiar partners by interviewing their family. When I'm working with communicators in this early stage, I want to focus on identifying potential communicative acts. And this is works by Jeff Sigafus. You can find in the resources page in your slides. There's also that wonderful Every Move Counts program, which is an assessment and intervention tool for working with pre-intentional communicators, right? Pre-intentional communicators that are not yet perhaps demonstrating any signs of intentional communication, but have some voluntary behaviors going on. And so identifying potential communicative acts, we take a look at what can this child control? What can they do with their body, facial expression, eye gaze, etc.? I want to take those and identify those as potential communicative acts that I can shape in my intervention process. And so I probably want to do that by watching the child, but most importantly, I want to talk to the family about what types of voluntary movements, and maybe even talk to the motor team if that child is perhaps delayed in motor skills with a diagnosis like cerebral palsy or something like that, on how can he control his body best and which movements can we focus on as potential communicative behaviors. I also want to look for evidence of intentionality in my interview and observation. If we're pre-intentional, our intervention is going to look a certain way as we move to shape intention. If we have intention, our intervention is going to move more towards shaping convention in our signals. I also want to know what current signals do we know about. So if I have an intentional communicator and they are using some signals already to communicate, I want to know what those are, and I'm probably going to develop a communication dictionary of sorts to really document those behaviors, those signals, what they seem to mean, and how the caregiver or partner is responding. I can then use that as a treatment tool as well, which we're going to talk about soon here. And then, of course, for these communicators, many of them have complex profiles, vision needs, motor needs, etc. So we need to be teaming in our assessment. I need my OTs on deck for children on the autism spectrum. I need my PTs, OTs, vision, etc. for children with cerebral palsy to help me really understand that whole child profile. If it's a school-age child, I also want to talk about literacy, what's happening, if anything, for this child in the school environment. I don't have literacy in my scope of competence, and so I'm going to reach out to those who do, and I'm going to be a strong advocate for kids, even at these early stages, to start building literacy into their education programs. So we talked a little bit about Dr. Patricia Dowden's CCI framework, and I've taken her framework with her permission and adapted it to be a little bit more caregiver friendly and to be focused on developmental populations. The CCI is ranged all the way through the lifespan, and it's emerging communication, context-dependent communication, and independent communication. My AAC journey spin on this framework really is only about developmental populations. And so we're going to talk about explorers being those emerging communicators, navigators being those context-dependent communicators, and conquerors being those independent communicators. And we're not going to talk a lot about conquerors today because we're talking about these children who have not yet reached communicative independence. You can access this PDF on the website as well. And if you're in the audience and you are someone who has AAC expertise, whether you're a professional, an AAC user, or a parent or partner supporting an AAC user that would be willing to mentor others in this process, go ahead and check out the guide that we have on the website. It's free to join, a free resource for everybody to access. And it's a project that hopes to build a community of AAC enthusiasts, AAC consultants, AAC guides, so that families and teams can find people in their area or virtually, if that's not possible, to connect with and receive support. So in thinking about explorers, I'm going to walk through kind of a broad intervention framework as well. And the intervention framework, really the point, right, for AAC intervention is we want to learn language with AAC. It's not learning AAC. Our goal is not AAC. Our goal is learning language with AAC. And so in my AAC intervention framework, I talk about the importance of pre-intervention assessment, right? Especially if you haven't done the assessment. If the child's coming to you and you are going to provide AAC supported service to them, you need to get a good baseline to set goals and strategies in place. So pre-intervention assessment is key. We also need to set the stage for learning, build upon their strengths, and then of course build AAC if it's not yet present, or strengthen AAC strategies if they are present. Again, we don't have time today to go in at length on this framework, but we're going to talk a little bit about intervention for explorers and navigators. So due to time, we don't have time to watch this video, but I did link it here for you. It's an amazing video that illustrates the way you can shape intentionality in some of our complex communicators using some pretty straightforward milieu teaching style strategies. So take a look at this link here, click it, and you can watch the video of Ella with her team learning to develop intentional communication from the voluntary movements that she can do with her body. But let's take a minute to talk about an explorer, an emerging communicator that's learning intention. Here are some potential intervention targets that we might want to use, right, based on what we know about typical communication development. We're going to shape intentionality, right? That's the key. And we're going to use the least effortful path. So this doesn't mean we have to shape intentionality through simple use. It may be most developmentally appropriate to shape intentionality through non-conventional, non-symbolic means, just like early infancy, and then eventually through conventional means, more conventional gestures, and then eventually moving to symbols, right? But we know we need to shape intentionality. This also assumes then that you don't have to be intentional in order to receive AAC support, right? AAC support includes shaping this piece. And so it is our job as speech professionals and language professionals to shape intentionality and to support families and other partners in that process. We also want to support all of the child's needs. And so if we've got motor, vision, sensory needs at the table, to set that child up for learning success, we need to have a plan for supporting their access to learning opportunities, right? And that may be learning opportunities through play, or it could be learning opportunities through academic experiences, or all of the above. So I'm going to work with my OT, vision, support team, depending on that child's needs, and I'm going to set the stage for learning by supporting those needs. We also may need to do or work with our motor team to do what Linda Burkhardt and Gil Porter call parallel programming, right? Some of our emerging communicators may have complex bodies that prevent them from accessing AAC systems in a least effortful way. And so we want to make sure that we are providing access to language in a way that they can access, perhaps in a least effortful way, and also program by teaching them access away from language at first. And then we're always modeling. Even at this early stage, we are modeling language verbally and immersively and visually for our students. What about learning convention? So if we have a communicator who's in the emerging stages coming to us that is intentional, but they're using some unconventional or less clear signs for communication, some of our potential targets may be shaping more conventional non-symbolic signals, right? Teaching giving, showing, pointing, eye gaze, vocalization inflections to communicate without spoken words. We were also going to continue supporting those motor, vision, and hearing needs or access needs and continue modeling that more advanced language. And here on this slide, you can see some examples of that previous concept of supporting the learning environment by providing access to environmental control and play adaptations, eye gaze games to learn access methods, switch toys, or multisensory rooms, or CVI dens, or something to help the child act on their environment to have routines for building communication. You have a slide here that gives you a little bit more direction and resources to learn about the shaping process for non-symbolic communication signals. I love to use pre-linguistic milieu teaching and enhanced milieu teaching principles in my AAC intervention for these communicators. So you can take a look at all of the resources on this slide. We also, of course, want our explorers to learn symbols, right? We don't want to withhold those until they're ready. We know they are ready, but the way symbol usage looks for an explorer may be different depending on what stage they're at. So some potential intervention targets might be that you continue to shape and respond to those such important non-symbolic signals, but that you also continue to support vision and motor access, to model language, and also to facilitate that first word vocabulary, right? So this is where we're going to channel our Gail Van Tatenhove and others where we're focusing on powerful core vocabulary as that first line of word teaching. And I love to use my communication dictionary that I make in my assessment process as a starting point. And then I use ecological or environmental inventory and developmental word lists to kind of help develop that vocabulary selection piece. And I think Laura Ninders is coming up after me, and she's going to talk a lot about vocabulary, so she might touch on a couple of these a little bit more. We're going to continue to work on access method here too, right? Because that's really the kicker for a lot of our kids who are explorers. They can't access their words, and maybe that's because of motor and vision. It could be for children on the autism spectrum, perhaps a sensory need or an attention need. So we're going to keep problem solving that access in our intervention. I gave you another resource slide here to talk about communication dictionaries if you're interested in getting some resources and learning a little bit more about how to use those. So what about features for explorers? When we think about AAC systems, how do we figure out the features? Well, we're going to be individualized, right? There's no one size fits all for goals, and there's no one size fits all features, but we know we need to use the skills to help us guide the features. So we're going to think about what the family preferences are, motor skills and needs, vision skills and needs. And then we're also going to figure out what are those communication skills that are present and what are the next steps in development, right? If I have a child who needs first words vocabulary, core vocabulary, then I know I need to make sure I've got verbs and adjectives available and some nouns and fringe as well, right? If I'm trying to build through Brown stages of development, which we're going to talk about here in a minute, then I want to make sure I have that vocabulary available to build that child that first 60-word vocabulary that they need to move into word combinations. This is another resource that you can access. That's the Brown Stages handout I just mentioned that talks through a lot of, okay, this is a child who's using symbols. Now, how do I make treatment decisions and how do I make feature matching decisions that support those intervention goals based on developmental continuums? So you can click on this link up here and you can see this live flip stack version of this book. And you can also download a PDF from our website. Running low on time, which I knew was going to happen when you try to shove all of this information into an hour. Got 6 minutes. Let's see what we can do. Let's talk a little bit about how this journey continues once the child now becomes that symbolic communicator, right? That first word user moving into context-dependent communication. So you've got Brown stages up here, and another way to think about it is single words to phrases to sentences to conversation, right? That's kind of where we're building our kids with the AAC bridge. And so we're going to now shift our assessment focus to talking about use or pragmatics, right? Use is the Bloom and Leahy term. Pragmatics is in a lot of Dr. Binger's work. We're going to talk about content and we're going to talk about form or semantics and syntax. This should all sound familiar from grad school. So now our communicators are moving into what Dr. Dowden would call that context-dependent communication, which means that they're using symbols reliably, but they're limited in terms of vocabulary, in terms of pragmatic function, such as partners and contexts, and in terms of form. I'm going to walk us through quickly here. And just highlight some differences in assessment. So assessment for a communicator at this stage is really going to focus heavily on content, form, and use. An explorer was means and functions, right? What are you doing and what does it mean so I can respond in my intervention process? But for children at this stage, it's content, form, and use. And of course, still keeping an eye on that literacy. If the child's using AAC, we also want to see how they're using it and with whom, and what types of scaffolding we might be able to do with the current system in place, or do we need to make modifications or suggest a new system so that they have access to what they need to move through development. All right, these are repeat slides. So for context-dependent communicators, we want to build vocabulary on their interests. We want to use single words to get snug, right? That spontaneous novel utterance generation. We might need some phrases for control and for some high need or sensory emergency situations, but really single words is what we want because that's what typical development has, right? And we're going to build that through all the things you guys already know. natural models, immersive models, aided language stimulation, and all of our bag of tricks of intervention tools. So I ran out of time, but you guys have the slides. I hope that you'll join me for some of our trainings coming up. You've got a lot of clickable resources to guide you through the Navigator piece of this talk. But I want to direct you to the end here and let you know that if you have any more questions or want to meet to talk about this further, you can certainly post them on the forum here. So I'll pause for 3 minutes to see if anybody has any burning questions. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share this with everyone. Hope to see you guys soon.
Hannah, some of the comments in your Slack are just saying how important this is to understand these stages, and people are saying they have a lot of explorers.
Yes. That's why the meat of this presentation was about explorers. I don't mean to get those navigators the short end of the stick, right? But our explorers tend to be the ones that are the hardest to pinpoint, and they're the ones that are underestimated, that it's easier for people to not presume potential, right?
Well, the foundations are so important to break this down. We really appreciate all the resources and the hierarchy of the explorers and the journey. It's some comments about what a great way to conceptualize language development.
Yeah, I wish I had more time. I hope to see everybody again soon at another talk to kind of dive into this a little bit further, but I'm happy to hear it was helpful.
Well, thank you so much. Your students are very lucky.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and especially to Tana.